The next stop in our Kingdom Hearts Insanity Tour is a game known as all of the following titles: Key, Unchained Key, and Union Cross, at different points during its lifetime. It was a mobile game with many of the typical mobile game trappings we've come to know and loathe in the succeeding years of the format. That lifetime ended in 2021 when the game was taken offline and essentially made into a cutscene compilation, the same with its successor, Dark Road, in August 2022. I didn't experience them in this way because it's literally impossible to. Both Union Cross and Dark Road were removed from all app stores in August of 2024. I say all of this as a preamble to this game's legacy in this series of baffling choices on where games are placed. Never has it been predatory and greedy in a way quite this severe. To put this game on mobile, make it always online and monetize to Kingdom Come, and then to place within it some of the most important story revelations in the series thus far, some with massive implications for Kingdom Hearts 3, was a decision so short-sighted, so corporate, so money-hungry that it honestly floors me. Let me explain a bit more. I played this game some when it came out. Honestly, I don't remember how much. The thought of being able to play Kingdom Hearts wherever I was at the time was of course tantalizing, but you have to realize that this game is not playing Kingdom Hearts. It's even less of a Kingdom Hearts game than Chain of Memories was. There is almost no action involved here. Battles, from what I remember and based on videos I've seen, play out a bit like this. You encounter an enemy and start a fight. On your turn, you play cards from your deck. The cards are referred to as medals in this one. Cards have an element attached to them, fire, water, and air or something. And there's a rock, paper, scissors element to the whole thing, but that for the most part didn't matter much. On the enemy's turn, they do something similar. You get cards from card packs and stuff like that. I'm far from an authority on the subject, but Everglow, one of the two primary reasons we can still experience this game in its fullness today, had this to say on the topic. Let's clear this up. Kingdom Hearts Unchained Key is mainly based on luck. You can't get good results if you don't pull good enough medals to fight with, and in order to have more chances to pull, you need to pay with actual money. Nothing is certain, even if you pay. You can either be doomed to play with weak medals for a long time or be extremely lucky to find powerful medals, which makes the game way easier. Thus, this walkthrough doesn't want to be a perfect kind like I used to do with all the previous released Kingdom Hearts titles, as skills and dedication are not enough to achieve that goal. Here's another quote from Reddit user Tay Dinger on the subject. Coming from someone who played it from start to finish, don't feel too bad that you missed it. Without massive time and money investment, the gameplay wasn't very fun. Medals were power crept almost instantaneously after release. You'd be doing great in the story content and then bam, you're suddenly doing single-digit damage. And even if you had the best medals, gameplay wasn't often more depth-filled than buff with your best buffers and attack with your best attackers. Adjust for color, but even that wasn't always needed. Most missions were complete filler, resulting in equally useless filler cutscenes. You'd play for hours, only to end up no better than where you started. Important story content would take months at a time to release. Of course, there was an immense feeling of satisfaction once you hit that important content, but it really wasn't worth the torture that preceded it. To have your game clearly and honestly described as torture from someone who literally comments on a Reddit dedicated to your series is the most convincing argument against the quality of the gameplay to me. Speaking to that filler, if you look at a playlist compiling every cutscene in Union Cross, you'll see that all of the cutscenes in this game take 18 hours and 25 minutes to get through. Compare this to Damo279's fandub movie, which purports to only contain the important cutscenes and leaves out all of the filler, which clocks in at somewhere around 6 hours and 15 minutes. Everglow's compilation, which touts explanations and no fillers, comes in at 5.5 hours. So the two agree to the point that roughly 2/3 of the cutscene content in Unchained Key and Union Cross is complete filler, absolutely unimportant to the story. Now, to be clear, something to this effect would likely be the case with every Kingdom Hearts game. They've always suffered, with the sole exception of maybe Kingdom Hearts 1, from having way too many cutscenes that don't actually matter and serve very little purpose. I've talked about this at length in the past, go check out the rest of this series if you haven't seen it. I think it's safe to say that this game has far and away the most filler of any Kingdom Hearts game so far. Filler is not uncommon when it comes to video games, but in this game, it's disgusting. Predatory even. You see, the important story that is here is seriously some of the best written, most interesting, and most important story content that we've had from the series since Kingdom Hearts 2. I would even go as far as to argue that this game might have the best story of any Kingdom Hearts game, full stop. I'll spend a bunch of time explaining why momentarily, but the point I'm trying to make here is this. We have a mobile game with a bunch of microtransactions, combat that is almost entirely decided by how much you pay, and a ton of filler content in between the important bits. But when those important bits do happen, it's spectacular and interesting and has grand sweeping implications for the series as it progresses from this point in the timeline. There are answers in this game, and Dark Road, which came after it, for questions that we've had since the very first game in this series, and the plot points herein have more implications for Kingdom Hearts 3 than basically any other game in the series, including the ones specifically designed to lead up to it. Do you think it's too far for me to say that this was on purpose? That they deliberately kept important story beats spread out with a bunch of power creep in between in order to encourage the whales they had built up to keep paying so that they could see where the story was going to go for themselves? In order to really stand a chance at getting to the next story revelation, you basically had to pay, which meant that Square Enix was going out of their way to manipulate those that loved this series for its story into paying, no doubt exorbitant amounts of money, much more than a fully priced console game, in order to experience it. It's the fact that this primarily preys on particularly passionate fans, that grinds my gears so much, on top of how short-sighted all of this is. One consistent thing in the mobile game space, or any online game for that matter, is that they will eventually shut down. And then what? Square kept these games on the App Store as offline experiences where you could basically just create a character and experience the cutscenes firsthand, but now even that is gone. On the one hand, there's a part of me that appreciates Nomura's dedication to making sure that every piece of KH content, even the free ones on mobile, are important and satisfying. On the other hand, I can't see this as anything more than a cash grab. All of this makes me extremely nervous for what Missing Link is going to look like when it releases on my 80th birthday. As for the story itself, this is my first time really experiencing it. Like I said, I played this game back in the day, but I have no idea for how long or if I even experienced any of the important stuff firsthand. I used Damo279's fan-dub movie for the note-taking process, mostly because it's fully voice-acted, which makes note-taking much easier, but also because it's just a really good fan-dub, honestly. Pretty much all of the volunteers do a good job of copycatting the voices they are supposed to represent, especially the Master of Masters.
Will be the cornerstones of the new world.
Now, to be clear, before we really get into this is an exceptionally complicated story, which is saying something considering the series we're talking about here, but despite that, I actually really like it. Here's a few key reasons why. Firstly, this story is its own compelling narrative that isn't obsessed with the other stories in the series that aren't directly related to it. The Wayfinders, or Sora's whole thing. This was a clear issue in both Birth by Sleep and Dream Drop Distance that I really don't like. It feels like nearly every story beat in those games is put there to recontextualize something from a previous game, and it's sloppy way more than it's not. Union Cross focuses on the story it's trying to tell, and only points forward in a few key moments that actually make it feel satisfying and not cheap. Secondly, and tangentially to the previous point, it doesn't muddy up the timeline or cause confusing recontextualization. In fact, it does much the opposite in many ways. This story introduces a lot of new characters, but ultimately the purpose of each of them is clear, and there's nothing here that tries to change a previous event in the series in order to support a new direction. Rather, anytime it connects back to previous events or people, its primary goal is to extrapolate and develop those events or people, not change them in a way that causes confusion. Here's a few caveats to this discussion before we begin. In terms of this video series aiming to tackle the games in release order, I'm going to break that rule a bit here. Unchained Key and parts of Union Cross came out prior to KH3 being released, but most of Union Cross and all of Dark Road was post KH3. It's my understanding that there's not really anything that could spoil KH3 in here, barring one reveal about a character's identity, and that knowing the full story of these games actually improves the experience of KH3 as a whole in ways that I'll bring up again in a little while. The context that KH3 brings to some of the plot points in this game could change how I feel about them, but for the sake of keeping this video series even partially coherent and enjoyable to watch as we near its conclusion, I'm going to talk about all of Unchained Key, Union Cross, and Dark Road in this video. My hope is that this will give me the best chance to enjoy Kingdom Hearts 3 when I come around to that one. In terms of how I'm experiencing this game, it's probably important to note that it's going to be quite different from those that experienced it firsthand as it came out, while playing through the mobile game. Not to mention, having the entire story of all three titles certainly has affected my understanding of certain plot points, if discussions of those plot points online are anything to go by. I have more context to pull from, so my conclusions may be different from someone who was experiencing it firsthand. I'm going to present the story in the way that makes the most sense to me given that context. Finally, having not actually played it from beginning to end, which I wouldn't have done even if I had had the choice, my experience with the stories and characters herein may be a bit skewed. For example, just about every gameplay element is tied into the narrative in some way. At one point, a little companion gives you a bangle that helps you in combat, but it's later revealed that this bangle also has negative implications in the story and causes strife amongst the key players in it, just to give an example of what I mean. This isn't going to matter to me much because I didn't play it myself, so just know that there may be elements of this I'm missing. Anyway, I think that's enough preamble. Let's get to the discussion, starting with the story of the Lost Masters. Meet the most important character in the series thus far, the Master of Masters. Master of Masters, or Mom for short, is a bit of a silly man. He's regularly sarcastic, wacky, and seems to enjoy freaking out his subordinates with his nonchalance in the face of what you will soon see is a catastrophic foretold future. The Master of Masters is a mastermind of sorts. His plan is what sets the events of this game in motion, and in a more esoteric way, the events of the entire series from this point. Everything sort of begins with Mom giving one of his students, Luxu, a role: observe.
Mom gives him 2 key MacGuffins which will carry on to the rest of the story and form the basis of his plan. The first is a big black box, a mystery to this day, but the master tells him that it's quite important and that he mustn't peek. Luxu, obviously curious of the box's content, presses him on it, to which he obliges. Luxu's only response is, "Why?" and the master says, "You'll see." The second is the Keyblade known only as No Name, which has an eye embedded within the blade. The master says the eye is his own. Luxu's goal is to pass down this Keyblade to his apprentice, and then on, all so that the master can see the future. In fact, the Book of Prophecies' existence is proof that Luxu succeeded. How's that for a brain tickler? We'll explain this more in a bit.
The master also gives roles to the rest of the foretellers, a group of 5 individuals apprenticed to the master and tasked with keeping the Book of Prophecies, as well as leading a union of Keyblade wielders each. To the stoic and confident Master Ira, he gave the task of leadership and keeping the people calm in the face of what's going to happen. To the brutish and zealous Master Osed, he gave the task of being Ira's right-hand man, but to look for when the time was right to overthrow Ira as leader. To the inquisitive and respectable Master Envy, he gave the task of observing and mediating amongst the union leaders. To the unassuming and gaunt Master Gula, he gave the role of finding the traitor hidden among the Union leaders. He also gave unto Gula a page missing from the copies of the Book of Prophecies in the possession of the rest of the Union leaders. Finally, to the loving and empathetic Master Ava, he gave the role of finding Keyblade wielders of potential from among the unions and creating a different organization, one that would fly in the wind like dandelions away from this world and onto another, to keep the light alive after the Keyblade War, which will soon take place, according to the Book of Prophecies. For the story of Unchained Key, the most important elements is the existence of that missing page given to Master Gula. On it is a prophecy of a traitor, though it's not clear enough for Gula to just know who it would be. The foretellers go about their business, leading their unions and instructing the Keyblade wielders within to gather Lux in the various worlds around them, basically little balls of light used as currency and needed by the unions for mostly inconsequential reasons. The Master also creates Chirithi, a spirit which accompanies each of the Keyblade wielders in the Union. Everyone gets their own that acts as a little tutorial buddy. Throughout the story, seeds of discord are sown amongst the foretellers when they realize there is a missing page from their books, and a traitor amongst them. This begins a lot of infighting, and things the Master specifically told them not to do. Some wanted to remain loyal to the Master's teaching, while others wanted to do what they thought was right, a la letting their hearts being their guiding key, a common catchphrase among the Master himself. Eventually, their infighting leads to a massive war which spells the end of the unions as they knew it. This was written in the Book of Prophecies, and the Master of Masters said that it couldn't be avoided to multiple of the foretellers. In order to avoid complete decimation and the end of light itself, Master Ava sends the dandelions to another world to keep the light alive. The Master also gave her one extra piece of information, a slip of paper which contains the names of 5 individuals who would become dandelions and leaders of the new unions. One name is circled in red. This one gets the Book of Prophecies. One such Keyblade wielder worthy of moving on to the new world is, well, you, the player. The character you create is a key player in this narrative and truly the narrative of the entire series, and even has their own voice. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to this Keyblade wielder as Damien from now on, since I used Damo's dubbed cut of the story for the note-taking process. So Damien is canon as far as I'm concerned. Damien joins one of the 5 unions and begins going out into the worlds to collect Lux. One thing you need to understand is that this game takes place during the Age of Fairy Tales, as it's referred to, which the rest of the series takes place after. At that point, all of the worlds were one. They were all connected directly by land, one large world encompassing all of the Disney worlds we've gone to throughout the series. The worlds were split up after the Keyblade War, meaning that the events of this game are what are spoken of as a nursery story to Kairi in Kingdom Hearts 1 and repeated at the beginning of this game. One interesting narrative device is related to the stories experienced in the Disney worlds throughout Damien's journey. Many of them are the exact same narratives which take place in the series after this point. So if those stories happen far into the future, why are they happening now? One character, an inquisitive boy who questions every aspect of the reality he lives in, thinks that it's the Book of Prophecies, projecting the future of these worlds. And that's actually what they are fighting through, rather than traveling to these worlds physically. This boy's name is Ephemer, and he and Damien become very close friends quickly. Not long after that, Ephemer goes missing, and Damien desperately tries to find him, even going as far as to go against the direct orders of the Union leaders and Chirithy. He meets a girl, Skuld, who helps him look. They eventually encounter and question Master Ava, who tells them that Ephemer was contracted to be part of the Dandelions and sent to another world. Skuld and Damien are also recruited, to which Skuld agrees pretty much immediately, but Damien isn't sure he wants to leave everyone else behind while they fight in a war. Another individual by the name of Strelitzia watches Damien from afar. She is recruited to the Dandelions and even to be a Union leader, but in the time leading up to the Keyblade War, she is killed by an unknown entity. The story ends with the Keyblade War. Damien fights valiantly, but falls in battle, only to be rescued by Skuld and Ephemer in his last moments. We're going to get into some discussions on all of this in a bit, but for now, a few questions remain. Perhaps, what happens to the Dandelions? Who exactly is Luxu? What's in the black box? And how exactly does all of this connect back to the main series? Thankfully, by the end of this video, you'll have the answer to all but one of those questions. This leads directly into the story of Union Cross, the follow-up / rebranding of Unchained Key. It begins with the Dandelion leaders gathering at the Keyblade graveyard. Ephemer and Skuld appear first, followed by the third, who is revealed to be, of all people, Ventus. A fourth appears, going by the name of Brain. Finally, Laurium, who, based on the name and hair color, would later become known as Marluxia as a member of the Organization 13. Considering the story so far, we can assume that this now takes place after the Age of Fairy Tales, and the worlds are now separated as they are in the series as we've known it. The Dandelion leaders set their unions straight to the same task they had before, gathering Lux, but there's an ulterior motive this time. Most of the gameplay in Union Cross is purpose-built to essentially overwrite the bad memories for these Keyblade wielders, those of the friends that they left behind in the war that raged. They go to different worlds, this time mostly those seen in Birth by Sleep. Each of the Dandelion leaders has a goal of some kind outside of leading the unions though. Laurium is searching for his sister, Strelitzia. He goes to ask a girl named Elrina who was in her union. You may recognize this as Larxene in a future life. Brain still seems to think they are heading for destruction, despite how seemingly cheerful things are going. Brain says something sort of baffling.
I'm going to become a virus and overwrite the program that is this world's future.
Which, despite the fact that this was repeated again later, this never seems to come to pass. At one point, Daybreak Town begins to glitch out. Brain knows that Daybreak Town was recreated as data in order to preserve it after the war. So the question then becomes, are they currently in the real world or the fake one? A portal, seemingly related to this glitching, opens up. This is about when Damien himself re-enters the story, and he offers to go to this new world, which is Game Central Station from Wreck-It Ralph. They then proceed to experience the story of Wreck-It Ralph verbatim in its entirety, so it's largely a waste of time. It's revealed that Brain was given the Book of Prophecies by Ava. She also gave him the note which determined who the Dandelion leaders would be, and who would get the Book of Prophecies, and she told him to read it when it was time. So he did, and he discovered that the note differs from reality in two key ways. The first is that Brain wasn't meant to receive the book. At this time, it's unclear who was. The second is that Strelitzia was originally meant to become a leader, which means one of the 5 members is an imposter. Later, the imposter is confronted, showing us that it's Ventus. He wasn't on the list. Ventus really remembers being recruited by Ava, but in reality, he was being puppeted by darkness. But not really the darkness as we've known it in the series thus far. Darkness has been understood as a manifestation of the negative emotions in people, lust for power, jealousy, resentment, etc. The darkness gives people power, but the heartless also feed on it. This darkness is different. It's more like an entity, and has its own will. It can even speak to the Dandelions and carries a conversation for a while. And, you guessed it, there are 13 of them. While being puppeted by Darkness, Ventus was the one that struck down Strelitzia. Darkness says that they have no goal of sorts, but that Ventus was the one that desired greater power, and Darkness just showed him the way to achieve it. Whether or not you believe this is one thing, but I find it interesting because, despite this being a very different representation of Darkness from the one we've known so far, the basic modus operandi is the same. Give people with negative emotions power in order to further their goals. The story ends with lifeboats, of which there are 7. These lifeboats were meant to carry the citizens of the Data Daybreak town out and into the real world once again. As it stands, only 5 remain. Another thread, Maleficent, uses one, at the behest of Darkness. Maleficent showed up in this time period after traveling back in time. Given that she says something about Sora following her here, it's probably sometime after the events of Kingdom Hearts 1 that this happens. She meets Darkness, who helps her to get back to her own time. This involves going to the lifeboats, but they aren't working correctly. The first trip takes her to the real Daybreak town from the Data one. The second trip sends her forward in time. There's a separate set of rules for traveling forward in time as opposed to backward. In order to travel forward, you must have someone with memories of you and a medium, something that belonged to you, essentially. This explains the scene at the beginning of Kingdom Hearts 2, where Maleficent apparates when the fairies remembered her. Seems like they knew this was a possible thing to happen, but neglected to tell anyone that it's possible that time travel shenanigans were taking place even all the way back then. The lifeboat Maleficent took is gone, and 1 is destroyed, leaving 5 instead, which, including Elrina and Damien, is not enough anymore. They bicker for a while about who is going, and it settles on Brain, along with Lauriam, Elrina, and Ventus. Before they leave, Brain gives Ephemer the Book of Prophecies, revealing it was him that it belonged to, along with his Keyblade of all things. They go to the real Daybreak town with a goal to figure out how to get everyone else out. Lauriam, Elrina, and Ventus are sent into the future, and Brain sends 2 life pods back so Ephemer, Skuld, and Damien each have 1. Before they can get in, they are accosted by multiple darknesses. They fight for a while, but Damien becomes possessed by one and begins attacking Ephemer and Skuld. Ephemer cries out, shooting a portal that sucks all of the darknesses and Damien in and takes them away. In the real world, Brain meets Luxu and they have an interesting conversation.
You're pretty smart, aren't you? It's a shame this lifetime is the only one you've got.
Ephemer and Skuld get in their lifeboats and return to the real world, while 1 still remains. Damien, now trapped in a tube with the other darknesses, reveals that he tricked them into thinking he was on their side so he could seal them away here. He locks the other exit, and the darknesses are trapped here, along with Damien. Ephemer and Skuld, after seeing the desolation of Daybreak Town in person, board the lifeboats one more time and go off into the future. Damien drifts in a void of light. Chirithy tells him that, if he doesn't go to sleep, his heart will drift into a new one, which leads us to this scene. We'll unpack that momentarily. A few post-credits scenes add more questions to the mix. First, it shows where each of the dandelions that went forward in time ended up. Lauriam and Elrena's fates are a bit vague from this point on. Ephemer seems to appear in a vast ocean of some sort, and Ventus is approached by a shadowy individual. Last but not least, a cloaked person carries the no-name Keyblade and drags the black box behind him. He removes his hood and reveals himself to be Brain. In the very next scene, Brain wakes up in a city and meets a man named Sigurd, who gives him his fancy hat back. He goes and sees a statue of the founder of this city, Master Ephemer. Confused? I was too. I think all of this will become more or less clear by the end of this video, but some questions will need to wait for a while. For now, we can take a look at some key elements of the Unchained Key and Union Cross stories that I wanted to discuss. Firstly, the ever so important Book of Prophecies. Unlike many prophecies in fictional media, this one wasn't birthed from nowhere. It was born of the experiences of the Master of Masters himself, from what he saw, particularly through the eye in his Keyblade, No Name, as it traveled through time along with Luxu, being passed down to multiple heirs. So the obvious question is this: if this Book of Prophecies was basically just the Master of Masters writing down what he saw, does that mean it's fallible? Can it be changed or avoided? What if he got something wrong? A few key things happen in the Master's writings that don't happen in reality, at least not exactly. For one, Strelitzia was written in a note from the Master to become a Dandelion leader, but she was killed instead. Ventus was nowhere to be found in the note, but became a Dandelion leader anyway, through the manipulation of darkness. Master Ava gives the Book of Prophecies to Brain instead of Ephemer, to which Brain literally says it was her only act against fate. Each of these things no doubt had an impact on the outcome of the events, and the way that the Master of Masters saw them. There's even evidence that the Master of Masters manipulated the text on purpose in order to push people in certain directions. In a scene between Luxu and the Master, it's revealed that he planted the lost page, which detailed the existence of a traitor among the foretellers deliberately in order to push them to fight and become enemies, thereby enacting the Keyblade War. And why would he do this? To capture and destroy the 7 most powerful darknesses inside the 7 foretellers: the Master himself, Luxu, Ava, Gula, Ira, Aced, and Envy. This plan is obviously drastic and calculated, which Luxu remarks on as well, but the Master says that you must relinquish sentiment when it comes to the fight against the darkness. So was the traitor actually a part of the future that the Master saw? Or was it just an idea planted because he wanted to push the foretellers to fight and take darkness unknowingly into themselves in order to be destroyed? I lean toward the latter, but honestly there's no way to know, and I actually really like that. With such a devastating and wide-reaching plan as this one, the implications of one interpretation or the other carry with them a sense of dread and foreboding. This is one of the many reasons I love the Master of Masters, despite how easily he could have been a stereotypical mastermind trope, as well as the Book of Prophecies, which to me is a pretty unique take on foretelling the end of the story in prophecy form. So then, what else was a part of his plan? Darkness says that they possessed Ventus because it was written to be so. It's unclear what passage they were referring to, but it does make it seem like the Master intended for Ventus to be possessed because Darkness was essentially reading over his shoulder while he was writing the book. But then why denote that Strelitzia was supposed to be a Union leader specifically? A couple things come to mind. Perhaps it's so that Darkness could have an easy target to replace with Ventus. Perhaps it was so Laurium would have cause to create division, which is the take I'm leaning toward, because here's my next topic. I love how the stories of Unchained Key and Union Cross parallel and contrast each other. The foretellers had a traitor among them, but decided to ostracize them and try to determine who it was. They couldn't in the end, but it drove them apart to the point of war. The Dandelions had an imposter among them. They knew exactly who it was, and yet they stood by him and called him one of their own anyway. It's clear from this parallel why the Dandelions were important. The foretellers had too much darkness to usher in a new age of light. The Dandelions were much more capable of a feat like this. Luxu says something interesting in a scene where Master Ava confronts him.
Has it occurred to you that maybe the Master wasn't so concerned about the world's future, but how we, his disciples, would let our hearts guide us?
This to me is the thesis of the Master's actions and the through line which connects everything. If you look at this story from this lens, you can begin to understand why everything happened the way that it did. The foretellers weren't ready or able to bring about light, so they were made to trap darkness instead. The Dandelions let their hearts be their guiding key in a way the foretellers could only have dreamt of, while they were so focused on keeping the Master's teachings or rooting out the traitor. The Master needed to know who would be able to protect the light, and so he planted ideas in order to encourage them to fight, to wrestle with their fears and doubts, and the Dandelions came out on top with a better sense of community and love than the foretellers could muster. It's this love, this heart, that brings Ephemer to build the city Scala at Caelum and keep the tradition of the Keyblade alive. Speaking of that future, Ephemer seems to land earliest. Laurium and Elrina are both unclear in time and place, though we can assume to some degree that they are of a similar time to each other since they both end up in the organization. Ventus ends up in the Keyblade graveyard, a shrouded figure approaching him. It's safe to assume this is Master Xehanort at this time, coming to collect Ventus and take him to the land of departure to kick off Birth by Sleep. As for Brain, he's a bit of a question mark at the moment. Perhaps he ends up sometime much later in Scala, but there's also this scene of him walking around a desert with the black box. The bonus scene reveals what this might have been. Luxu says,
Amid the chaos, I bequeathed my Keyblade to one of the Union leaders, just as the Master instructed.
So the easiest answer is simply that Brain is really Brain in the desert with the box. But then what about the one in Scala? He can't be both, right? Well, there are still more questions, this and the fate of Damien perhaps being the most prominent, but in order to answer them, we'll need to take a look at Dark Road, the final successor in this line of mobile games. As a note, Dark Road came out entirely after Kingdom Hearts 3, which means I'm breaking my rule of only experiencing things in release order here. As I said in the beginning, this one is justified, I believe, because the events of Dark Road don't really affect Kingdom Hearts 3's story directly and really only serve to answer some questions brought up in Union Cross and further characterize a few key players in the stories going forward. Dark Road tells its story in a fairly non-linear fashion.
For the sake of understanding the content properly, I think it would be best for me to explain it in the order it happens, roughly anyway. The game begins with a young Xehanort who lives on Destiny Islands before the brown-cloaked man from the beginning of Kingdom Hearts 1, who we now know to be himself from the future, brings him through a dark portal and into Scala at Caelum, where he begins to train as a Keyblade wielder. Most of the story follows the lower classmen, those in Xehanort's grade, himself, Ericus, Herman, Bragi, Erd, and, hope the YouTube censors don't catch me for this one, Vor, as they go to different Disney worlds in search of the missing upperclassmen, who were in the middle of their Mark of Mastery exams and just sort of vanished. Their journey takes them to Wonderland, Agrabah, Dwarf Woodlands, Beast Castle, and Olympus Coliseum. They learn that the upperclassmen aren't actually missing, but are acting of their own volition. They are apparently trying to disrupt the world order at each of these places in an attempt to find 7 pure lights to combat the darkness and summon Kingdom Hearts. Largely, these events at the Disney worlds are inconsequential, as you probably would imagine, minus the stuff directly related to the upperclassmen. At one point during their journey, all the lowerclassmen are sucked into a dark corridor without any protection from the darkness. Everyone except Xehanort and Ericus dies, them being saved by their master, Odin, who doesn't matter. In the end, one of the lowerclassmen, Baldur, is revealed to be a vessel of darkness, and he lays waste to the upperclassmen. He and Xehanort end up having a pretty stereotypical, you're just like me, you know, conversation, and then Xehanort defeats him. This leaves only 2 Keyblade wielders in training, Xehanort and Ericus. The next few talking points take place some amount of years after the events of Dark Road. Keep in mind that they aren't additive. If I say an event takes place 1 year later and the next event is 2 years later, it's 2 years from the events of Dark Road, not 2 years after the event that was 1 year later. Now that that's clear as mud, 1 year after these events, the Master of Masters shows up to Xehanort and gives him a black cloak like his, telling him to go out into the world and observe people's hearts. Sometime later, Xehanort returns to the Master and tells him what he thinks of the heart. He believes that it's mostly darkness, and what light is there is fake. It's unclear what he observed to come to this conclusion. 2 years after these events, Ericus and Xehanort discuss their time exploring the worlds, and Xehanort remarks that he wants more than 1 lifetime, 13 to be exact. This is perhaps a little too on the nose for me, but whatever. Ericus, on the other hand, wants to be a light in the darkness to anyone that would venture out into the worlds. 4 years later, and Xehanort leaves, Ericus telling him what happened, assumedly the events with the upper and lower classmen, wasn't his fault. Okay, big time jump now. 54 years into the future, Master Xehanort shows up to Ericus, saying he wants to forge the Keyblade and start another Keyblade war to summon Kingdom Hearts. He wonders aloud if they will be worthy of the light that legends speak of. Ericus obviously doesn't condone this. 65 years later, and we see Xehanort and Vanitas. Xehanort explains what happened to the 13 darknesses that contained individual wills. 7 were trapped in the Lost Masters, 4 were trapped in the Data World with Damien, 2 were destroyed when Daybreak Town collapsed, 1 is said to have survived. Xehanort clearly believes that the last darkness resides in Vanitas, though Vanitas plays dumb the whole time. Oh, also, this person, Bragi, is a vessel for Luxu. Baldur at one point is about to try and kill him, but Bragi pulls out his Keyblade and thoroughly shuts him down before just saying he's going to leave because he likes this vessel. Also, check out that as if in the same scene. This also reveals that Braig, or Xigbar, is a vessel for Luxu as well. So obviously, a major element of the origin story of a villain can and should be, how does this person become the villain that they are today? Xehanort in this story fights for the light, in his own way, mind you. He's not all sunshine and rainbows like Ericus, and he's definitely pessimistic to a large degree. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have the best interest of light in mind for most of the story. So the question is, how does he become the darkness-toting villain we know him as today? One through line connects multiple aspects of this story: expectations. Let's look at one scene we haven't yet, the post-credits scene, which shows more of a young Xehanort and that blue-robed individual. Xehanort remarks to them that he sees dreams of people he doesn't know, those of the story of Union Cross, and in particular, the player character. As a note, he later remarks that he never got to meet these people from his dreams. He describes each of them, one with curly silver hair, one with black clothes and a hat, one with pink hair, quiet boy with blonde hair, a girl with dark hair just like his mom, and then he says, this other one, kind of like you, which shows us that the blue-cloaked individual is Damien, or rather the player character from Union Cross. It's my understanding that most people thought, based on the last scene from Union Cross, that the player character's heart melts into Xehanort's, meaning that we technically are Xehanort, but this scene shows that's not the case. Well, we actually are responsible for Xehanort, but I'll get into that in a second. Damien says that Xehanort has connected with his memories, which assures him that Xehanort is the child of destiny. What is that, you ask? Damien explains.
In the Book of Prophecies, it is written that light was to expire and darkness prevail, but that the child of destiny would change this outcome. They would have the ability to feel, share, and embrace what others felt in their hearts, and even connect their heart with another to become one. He would hail from the Isle of Destiny. So, Xehanort was told by Damien, probably multiple times throughout his formative years, that he was this quote-unquote child of destiny that would reverse the outcome of the ultimate battle between light and darkness, which is a massive expectation to place on a person, a child no less. It's important to note that Xehanort visibly falls asleep in this scene prior to the part where Damien says the child of destiny would change the outcome. By the way, if you've ever held a baby till they fell asleep, you know that this moment, this one right here, is like the best thing in the world. Anyway, I believe this could likely mean that Xehanort, at least subconsciously, but maybe even on some degree consciously, saw his goal as ensuring that darkness would prevail. Damien also believes that Xehanort would become Light's master because of his blood connection to Ephemer. We'll talk more about all of this in a bit. As for the next expectation, the Keyblade Masters all say they need to be protecting the light. What Xehanort learns, or at least thinks he does, after the events of this game is that the light of the heart is a facade, that darkness is the heart's true nature, which largely conflicts with the idea that light is to be protected. This also conflicts with what he subconsciously thought was his destiny, if my theory is correct anyway. Finally, the Master of Masters himself places expectations on him to question his surroundings, to study the heart and find its true nature. This is what sets him on the path to learn that darkness is the basis of every heart, further driving home the idea that darkness is the ultimate end goal. All of these things led him down the path to wielding darkness like a weapon, and I believe it's mostly congruent with the actions he takes after the events of Dark Road. Even his Heartless agrees with all of this. Another critical aspect of this game's story is what it has to say about destiny, a topic I've been more or less bringing up for this entire video series. As a story, it begins on a place literally called Destiny Islands, and one thing I loved was that Sora in the first game was not a generic chosen individual, but someone that did what he believed was right, and in doing so, managed to save the worlds multiple times over. Now, it's fairly clear, based on Damien's description of the Child of Destiny, along with the rest of the story in the series, and spoilers for Kingdom Hearts 3, I guess, what happens at the end of that story, that Sora himself is the Child of Destiny. And I mean, who else could it even be? It's certainly not Xehanort, despite what Damien believes. But the important thing is that we know that Damien told him he was, and that Sora actually is, but was never told so. It becomes clear to me that the future, prophecies, and destiny are not set in stone in this series. Sora becomes the Child of Destiny by following his heart and doing what is right, not because he was told he would and he felt a sense of obligation to the one that told him. In fact, Xehanort himself becomes the antithesis of the Child of Destiny because he had high expectations for himself given to him by others. The one that was prophesied to become the Child of Destiny ended up becoming the exact opposite, the one for which the Child of Destiny must come to pass. I really love this because it is an interesting subversion of the Chosen One narrative. Honestly, it makes a lot of what I didn't like about Birth by Sleep a bit more palatable as well. Consider this. Riku also ends up becoming a vessel of darkness, even though he was gifted a Keyblade by Terra. Sora was not, but he's the one that ended up getting it, and he fought for light. What if Riku was so cocksure of himself, so overzealous and confident because he was explicitly told he was special by this mysterious stranger? What if that exact thing was what drove him down the road to darkness? It would parallel Xehanort's story and explain what made him such a good fit to be a vessel for Ansem for a while. See, that's what prequels should do. Make the stuff that came before it better thanks to the recontextualization they provide. I think this one does a really great job of that, and hopefully it's more clear to those that disagreed with my takes on Birth by Sleep and Dream Drop Distance what it is I'm looking for in a recontextualization. A few more interesting topics to discuss and clear up. First, the identity of Luxu. It's clear that Luxu is moving through time, using vessels and making sure no name gets passed down. He really seems to have a thing for people with the letters B, R, A, and I in their name. Braggy, Brag, and, oh yeah, Brain. So there's a question that people are still debating to this day brought up from Union Cross, that of the identities of the two brains present at the end, the one that wakes up in Scala and the one that is walking in the desert. Given the rules of time travel and the events of the game, both of these people can't be Brain. So, which one is which? Let me present an explanation, then I'll present the other explanation and why I don't agree with it. I don't believe that Brain was ever possessed by Luxu, meaning this person in the desert really is Brain. Luxu sent Brain off with the Keyblade and the box. This is supported in two ways. The first is the line spoken at the end of Union Cross. Amid the chaos, I gave my Keyblade to one of the Union leaders. Now I must depart to fulfill my final task. This line is also present in the secret reports of Kingdom Hearts 3. So Luxu must have given his Keyblade to someone. Brain is the Union leader that we see carrying it, so it makes sense that it'd be him. Furthermore, most of Braig's story in Kingdom Hearts 3, or rather Luxu's story in Kingdom Hearts 3, is centered around him trying to find the box before Maleficent. If Luxu had possessed Brain in this scene and was the one dragging around the box, why would he then need to find it later? Counterpoints to this argument say that, well, there's a pretty big, though unspecific, time gap between these two events. It could be around 75 years or so, maybe, but it's hard to tell exactly. So the box could have gotten lost during that time. My question would then become, why would Luxu wait till now to search for the box? Assuming he's been Braig/Xigbar for the entire series, he didn't care about the box until Kingdom Hearts 3. Of course, the box didn't exist until Union Cross, so there's that, but still. The alternative most people use is that the brain in the desert is actually Luxu and that he was lying in the secret reports when he said he passed down his Keyblade. My problem with that is that it has to assume he lied in a secret report that was written to no one in particular. This isn't like where Xehanort obfuscates truth in the reports expressly written to Ericus. I see no good reason to believe that Luxu lied in these reports just to justify this interpretation. Now, assuming the brain in the desert is the real one, who is the brain in Scala? Demo279 had an interesting theory that I'm going to take as fact until proven otherwise. That one is a data copy of Brain sent into the future. You can go check out his video on the subject if you want, but the evidence is in the fact that Union Cross plants the idea of data copies of people all over the place, but then seemingly does nothing with it. Unless this theory is true, in which case all of that planting was there to point us in the direction of figuring this out. It could certainly be wrong, but it's convincing enough that I'd be surprised if it is. Next, let's discuss the player character a bit more. At the end of Union Cross, the player becomes the blue-cloaked individual who raises Xehanort. Many people thought that the player character would become Xehanort, since that's sort of what the end credits scene of Union Cross implies, and that would also mean that the player character is responsible for Xehanort because they are them. It also explains why Xehanort was having the memories of Union Cross before we got the explanation at the end of Dark Road. This would be a beautifully ironic twist if it were true, except it is true, just not in the way that that implies. The player doesn't literally become Xehanort, but if my theory about him is correct, he does have an extremely heavy hand in making Xehanort into the man he eventually becomes. It's the expectations placed on him, telling him he's the child of destiny, that drives Xehanort to the lust for darkness and power that he eventually finds himself sunken in. Honestly, I find this to be powerful storytelling, and I'm surprised and maybe even a good bit angry that it's hidden away in this mobile game and not told in the actual games you can actually play in this series. This stupid mobile game gets this awesome story while Birth by Sleep and Dream Drop Distance get, well, whatever the heck it is that they got. To be fair, I did experience these stories sans filler, and maybe that would improve my taste for BBS and DDD, but even then, those stories to me did such a poor job of expanding the narrative that I don't know that it would make much of a difference at all. The player's decision to deem Xehanort the child of destiny also stems from a bias. The kid hails from Ephemer, so clearly he's going to be a great man, right? Perhaps if the player had not let their judgment get clouded by their fondness for Ephemer, they wouldn't have created the strongest villain in the series. It's actually kind of silly, honestly, when you think about it. Another piece of evidence for the player believing that Xehanort is the child of destiny is that he hails from Destiny Islands, but he doesn't naturally. He was born in Scala and brought there by the player. It really makes you think that the player desperately wanted the child of destiny to be Xehanort for some reason. Mostly their love for Ephemer, I would assume. Very interesting storytelling. As one last note, let's just discuss the man of the hour for a moment, the Master of Masters. Honestly, I adore this character. I find it interesting that they decided to take him in this direction, though whimsy and silliness is funny and surprising. Even more important than that, though, are the times when he drops this facade and all of a sudden he becomes deadly serious. These moments are gripping in their contrast. I also find his machinations compelling too. The Book of Prophecies brings up a bunch of interesting questions that we've already discussed. As for the black box, well, I don't love it, mostly because I've seen it before. If you're wondering what's inside, it's the same thing that's in the box from FNAF 4. Everything and nothing, because it doesn't matter. Things like this are the easiest way to build mystery without actually having to work for it, and my brain rejects it on principle. His plan is devastating and full of what appears to us to be sacrifice, but he comes at it from the opinion that there is no greater cost that exceeds defeating darkness as a reward. It's not difficult to say he's right, since he's somehow managed to ensure there wasn't any sacrifice at all, but it is interesting nonetheless. And we've come to the end of another video. Thanks for watching this far. Next up, we have Oh, well, what do you know? Kingdom Hearts 3. The astute among you may notice that I'm skipping 0.2 A Fragmentary Passage, and you'd be right, because that game is a glorified tech demo for Kingdom Hearts 3 and doesn't do much that affects things going forward. I'll bring it up in the Kingdom Hearts 3 video if it's relevant. That being said, if you really want to know my thoughts on it, consider joining my YouTube memberships. Those at the second and third tiers got access to this video a week early, and those at the highest tier get a video where I discuss my thoughts on 0.2, on top of a veritable smorgasbord of content since I started doing these membership videos. They also get their names read out loud, so let's jam. Amari316V2, QuezBT, Mastro Chef, OMFG, It's Justin, The Monkus, and Josiah Keen. Thanks to these people for their extra support. See you soon.